Hi, this is John Quinlan. Welcome to Forward Forum. I have a fun show coming up, great opportunity I've been looking forward to for some time. I'm going to be in conversation with Dave Dahmer. Dave is the editor-in-chief and publisher of a great new online publication, Madison365.com. And it's a publication that attempts to bring voice to communities of color, to people in places that often aren't heard from. And it's in keeping with the legacy of Dave's long body of work working for publications like the Madison Times and in many different settings and venues, including his work with Centro Hispano as a board leader. Hey, Dave Dahmer, welcome to Forward Forum.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here today.
Well, it's great to have you here. Let's actually just start at the place of maybe introducing folks who I'm sure are probably pretty familiar with your work, but maybe haven't associated you back with it or what your background is. This comes out in the editorials you write and everything. Like me, you grew up in small town Wisconsin, up in Sheboygan. And one of the things I heard you reflect upon recently is, ironically, you probably have the same experience I do. I grew up in very homogeneous communities where there weren't a lot of representatives of communities of color, diverse communities. But boy, has that changed over the years. And I think you found that experience recently on the beach in Sheboygan,
I
right?
did, yeah. Sheboygan in the 80s was not diverse at all. I mean, it was very white. It was very, and I went back, and I go back as I do periodically because my family's there, my parents are there. And on the 4th of July, we have a big celebration along Lake Michigan. It just goes for a mile along. And I was down there, and I couldn't believe how diverse it was.
Yeah.
I mean, black families, Latino families, Hmong families, and it was cool to see. It was like Sheboygan has really changed. It's something you don't see very often, the intermingling between cultures.
So we did a show recently about Bob Kastenmeier. Bob Kastenmeier, our former congressman for many years, grew up in Beaver Dam, which is where I went to high school. Again, one of those really homogeneous communities in some ways. And in talking to Dave Zwiefel from the Cap Times about this, just kind of wondering, where did his awareness of the wider world of civil rights struggles, because he was right out there in front in many ways, out in front of JFK and other people, in terms of the civil rights legislation, that it couldn't just be federal, that it had to address stuff at the local level. He embraced human rights. He did away with laws that potentially were going to put people in internment camps all over again, worked with the diversity of groups. But this is a guy who was a white guy from a small town. And I'm not sure we totally came up with the answers, other than it was just kind of hardwired into his soul that he was eventually, when he did experience a more diverse world, going to understand and get along with folks. Well, what's your own life journey? Do you think back to growing up, and this was kind of all a mystery to you, and how did it become something that was kind of part of your heart and soul?
Well, I think, once you start to get involved in different things and you start getting around in diverse environments, I mean, it's exciting, it's fun. And, you start to do it, and after a while, it no longer becomes a diverse environment. It's an environment. And, obviously my job at the Madison Times as the editor for 10 years, and I worked for Madison Times before that. I mean, I was always in these different communities where I was often the only white person there. But after initial, it just became normal for me. Yeah. It's like, this is normal. I became more uncomfortable when I had to cover white events, because it's a different, and so it's, I don't think it's anything special about me. It's just, it's just what I do, and the friendships that I've made, and I've made such great connections over the years that it's just, to me, it's exciting. It's fun, especially because traditionally, these communities have not been covered at all or very well by the mainstream media. So you're missing out on all of these stories that are going on, all these great stories, because nobody has taken the time to actually go in these communities and ask people, well, what do you think?
You're a humble guy, but I think it is about you. And I think some of the things you model in the editorials that you talk about. Unfortunately, we'll have a chance throughout the hour to expand on these things, but Madison's a tale of two cities. I mean, there is a place that holds itself up as a place where diversity and progressive values, reign, and yet for a good portion of our city, that's not necessarily their experience of us. In fact, racial disparities are much worse than cities where you expect to have greater problems. In fact, the Madison, Portland, Seattle Austins of the world, have more. So all of those themes we'll expand upon. But so let's come back to that in a minute. But let's talk about what you've created here. There was a change in ownership of Madison Times, and without dredging up difficult things, every time there's a change there, we lose somebody like a John Gramling or a Dave Dahmer, and
right.
you have to make other choices about what to do as your next steps. Having the Capital City Hughes on the scene, you've always been very respectful of what John has been able to do. So,
right.
so in some ways it was cool that happened. And with you got to realize this vision of Madison365.com along with Henry Sanders. Yep. I know you have another business partner,
Rob Chappell.
So what gets you fired up about this? What is there about Madison365.com that's maybe a little different than what has been done before?
Well, I think first of all, it's 24/7.
Yep.
So I mean, it's the way that news works these days. A lot of publications are weekly or bi-weekly or they're monthly. The print publications, and they're great publications, but sometimes things happen, and it's just like time passes, and people are on to the next thing. Mm. But this is the ability here to, when something happens, we're with it immediately, and the focus is youth. We don't necessarily discriminate, but all of our writers are of color, very young or youngish, 20s. But we don't necessarily discriminate, but that's just what we focused on, because whose voices aren't being heard? Who are we missing out on?
Well, unfortunately, who's not being reached by print publications these
right.
days, because young people don't tend to
no,
go to those.
They don't, and I love print. I've probably told you this before, that I was a paper boy back in Sheboygan.
I didn't know that.
I had 2 paper routes, and so your hands are full of print. You open it up, and even the center spreads that we had at the Madison Times.
The smell is intoxicating, for goodness' sake.
Yeah, well, I mean, I always loved print, but I realized that, we realized that print, it was people were getting their news on their phones.
Yeah.
People of color, especially, the phones and tablets and online, and if you really, and even if you really like something, you can still print it out on your printer.
Yeah.
But we just realized that there was a transition that was being made, and we just thought that this would be part of it. And the great thing about Madison 365 is that it's all the time. It's constant.
The only caveat I put on it is I think it doesn't have to be either or, and I think that actually print may be resurging. We used to think that Kindle meant that nobody would be buying physical books anymore.
Right.
I don't think that's going to happen. I think there's something about looking at a book and having it tangibly in front of you, having it on your shelf, that's different than having it on a hard drive someplace.
Yeah, and I do both. I mean, I'll
right.
read a book, and I will read a book on my phone.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's good for my eyes, but I will do both. And there's still a lot of people that do. And I'm not suggesting that,
No, you're not. But I'm just saying, though, you can move into recognizing those new realities and everything without abandoning the old ones.
Right.
We get into discussions sometimes in community organizing. Well, gosh, we just should do everything now by email and electronically because it's just an older dinosaur-like audience that you reach, otherwise.
Right.
No, I mean, still send them mailings. Maybe not as many. Still deal with print, but it's just a whole other thing that you're building on the foundation of what print meant.
And we want to be able to still partner with print. The great thing about Madison 365 is that we're a nonprofit.
Yeah.
And a lot of these are profits. So we want to help those print publications, because they make their money from advertising. We want to be there, and we want to be seen as someone that can help them too. That we can form partnerships together. We're just trying to get We've obviously talked about this before. There are almost 0 paid journalists of color in the city.
Yeah.
There was one by the Capital Times just hired this last summer. Was the first one in a while. In the major newspapers. So.
And it was championed by Chris Rickard from the State Journal. You said we didn't have any people of color. We have one, damn it.
Just hired one this summer, so he did prove us wrong.
So not to diminish the contributions of that individual, but that it's not about just having one person.
But in a city of 250,000 people, people, it's ridiculous. So what we're doing is we've found a lot of these great young journalists, and they're not obviously not polished journalists at that age, but they're very creative, they're intelligent, they're very eager to get into the community.
Yeah.
And it's not only about the journalism, it's about creating the next community leaders of color too. I mean, we're networking them, and we're getting them to meet other people that can help them.
So there's a few directions I want to go off of that, but I want to come back to the nonprofit thing in just a minute. But what you're talking about, I think, is also resonant with the Simpson Street Press, with Jim Kramer and other folks that are able to do there in terms of young journalists of color, high school age, but you're taking it then a little bit further into the 20s and 30s, a younger generation.
Right.
And those opportunities are really important because, as is true of almost every other aspect of life, it's harder for someone from a community of color, given the prejudice they have to deal with, the lack of opportunities that a lot of us in majority culture and the networking that we take for granted. You need to create those opportunities. You need to be conscious about it. It doesn't just happen. I think that's one of the things that Chris Rickert, in writing this, I mean, he writes lots of good stuff. But unless you, I hope to think that the two of us are in this category, unless as a person of majority culture, you really try to put yourself in someone else's shoes and understand all the extra challenges, you can't possibly be a catalyst for change that offers new opportunities. And you realize that early on, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't take that long to figure that out. I mean, if you spend somebody who, you know, I take for granted the advantages I have. And I think of myself as someone who's worked very hard their whole life, but you know, just the different things that I've had that I've seen that other people don't have. I mean, you know, you totally take that for granted. And so when people commentate on things that they don't really understand, you know, they just need to spend some time in the communities and really see what's going on. There's so many really bright people who never get a chance, and we're trying to give people a chance. And we're trying to give, because it is networking. It is who you know. It is your brother, your dad, you know, who often gets you the job, or a friend, or this or that.
Right.
You know, more often than not, the smartest person, the best person, doesn't get the job. So we're trying to find all of those people, not only for that, but just to get the voices heard. You know, we want to hear those voices. What do you think about this? Because everything is dictated by the majority community, you know, but maybe people who are actually affected by these things have a different point of view, and we want to hear that point of view.
And the distinction you're making, I think, is an important one, an important framework for people who aren't in part of communities of color. I think to a certain extent, I feel some commonality being a gay man. I think for folks with disability, actually most of us have some framework for understanding the other. I think we have to understand the profundity of racial discrimination, that it isn't necessarily analogous. But you come back to that statement, you may know that you're a hardworking guy, you know, and I think we all acknowledge that. But I think the distinction that some folks in white majority culture don't understand is you can be a hardworking person of color and still not have those networks or those opportunities. And it's not special rights or special privileges that you make efforts like this to bring those voices in.
Yeah, no, that's definitely, yeah.
So to come back to the nonprofit idea, I know we've talked about this, you know, in some contexts. I've been going to media reform conferences for the last 12 years. We had a big one that it actually began here in Madison. Arguably, in some ways, the media reform movement began in Madison. Just one quick tangent there. The media justice movement also began that week when we realized, even though it was great to hear from Bill Moyers and Phil Donahue and lots of older white guys who are great people who get this stuff, there were no people of color on that stage at the Orpheum the first year. Malkia Cyril, who's an amazing young activist, called them on it, tapped them on the shoulder, and basically said, there's something wrong with this. And so they gave her a full half hour to expound on what it felt like to be a person of color who didn't see herself represented on that stage. And what, in my conversations with her at future conferences, she really feels like, to their credit, they got that. They understood, and they did differently. And they had Van Jones and all kinds of other wonderful journalists and commentators of color, you know, at future conferences. But anyway, in terms of media reform, it's almost been a footnote. You know, and I love John Nichols dearly, but he's sort of, the last few times I've heard him speak, it's like he's lamenting the demise that young people just don't have a future, and we're going to have to all get used to the idea that social media doesn't pay, and it's just not like when we grew up. And I'm sorry, I'm making fun of him, and I don't mean to do that, except that, I'm sorry, I think sometimes older generations, we forget that there are new paradigms, there are new ways of doing things. Journalism has always evolved, always moved into new directions. I think nonprofit journalism is the future. You look at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, which has just been produced by Gannett, where the fear is they're going to do what they've done with every other paper. They're going to squeeze the profits out. They're going to squeeze the heart and the soul of the experienced journalists. All the work that's been done to cover diverse communities is going to be seen as secondary to maximizing getting that 42% profit margin.
Well, even lower than secondary. I mean,
exactly. But if you are trying to satisfy the shareholders and all of the folks that are a part of a for-profit operation without that sense of community service and obligation, and you're owned by some kind of distant multinational out of San Antonio or someplace, you miss how local it is, how journalism is the fourth estate. It is just as important as the three branches of government. We somehow have missed all of that in the name of profit. So for-profit sounds like a much better way.
Well, yeah, and you notice with the State Journal and the Capital Times that they got rid of a bunch of really great writers.
Get rid of a Doug Moe. I mean, what are you doing? Why was this a wise? I mean, even television programmers. I apologize. I'll let you talk, but it's this is something we both really care about. I mean, even a TV program understands you don't get rid of your stars, or you don't cancel 60 Minutes, which is one of the top-rated programs, ironically, of all time. You got to keep it interesting. You got to have people with a depth of experience. You don't just program pablum, but print newspapers don't seem to understand that.
Well, and then if you're going to get rid of these talented older white guys, I mean, where does that leave diversity? How does diversity even have a chance? It's not even on the table, to hire some, because we're getting rid of these guys. We're shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. We're not going to go start covering these communities more because we're shrinking the model. We have less and less. So we had to make a decision to be, when we first started Madison 365, to be a for-profit or a nonprofit. And it just seemed like the nonprofit nationwide, there's just been so many ProPublica and MinnPost just next door in Minnesota, and just all these that are just thriving on the nonprofit model. And so we decided that we would do that.
What used to be the St. Petersburg Times, which I think is now the Tampa Bay Times, is one of the pioneers in this. And actually, John Nichols and Bob McChesney write about a chapter about this in a recent book. My cousin Nancy was the consumer reporter. I'll have to tell you more about her story later. She unfortunately died of brain cancer about 7 years ago, and used her consumer column to talk about what she was going through. I met many of your colleagues at her funeral, and it was a very diverse staff, but it was a staff that was motivated by doing the right thing by the communities that they served, not by the bottom line, because they were a nonprofit. They had to break even. They had to be fiscally responsible, but not squeeze every last dime out at the cost of quality. And it just seems like but unfortunately, this model hasn't necessarily taken off. We still have these huge corporations that own and are consolidating more and more media. Right. So I think what you're doing not only will have an impact here, but if you succeed, you're creating a model that could be in place other places.
Yeah, and we'd like to see that. We're just taking things one thing at a time right now.
I know. But, we're what, 2 months into?
No, but long term, you're right. I mean,
today, Madison, not tomorrow, the world, but maybe next year.
If we can do it here, why can't it be done in other places? And so far we're doing it. We're doing it.
But that is, I think, part of your vision. You see that things that happen here in Madison have a resonance in other places, and we've alluded to this. But I mean, again, the fact that Dane County is the worst county in the country, or the second worst, I can't remember, not as much of a distinction, in terms of the disproportionate incarceration of black men, in terms of education, in terms of the disproportionate number of people of color living in poverty, everything else. This is a miserable place to be, and for many people of color. Right. How did it's just the question is, how do we let that happen? But you wrote a really interesting editorial, and it was similar to some discussions we'd had earlier. And you're not claiming this is an original idea, but it's not articulated very well here. It's the Madisons, the San Franciscos, the Portlands, the Seattles, the Austins, the Lincoln, places that are college towns and ostensibly liberal enclaves that ironically are doing the worst in terms of racial justice and equity. Right. Well, why would that be?
Well, because it's out of sight. It's out of mind. It's not because anybody's bad. It's so much easier to say that person's, they're bad. That's why this is. But they're not. They're really good people, really liberal people, really nice people, really progressive people, really open-minded people. Just great people. But they just don't see it day to day. The city is segregated. It's not Milwaukee by any means, but it's becoming more and more segregated. So, if you don't see something in your day-to-day life, I mean, there's no impulse to, if Walker does something, we storm the Capitol with 100,000 people, anything, we get angry. But, if a kid is not doing well, a kid of color, we're just like, oh, that's too bad, that makes me sad. But we're not we're not energized like, okay, we got to do something about this, and it's rampant. We have the worst racial disparities in the nation, and so when the equity report came out, everybody's like, oh man, that's so bad. But anybody who's been in the community, people of color, are just like, yeah, what are you telling me? Duh,
right.
So It's not that people are not good-hearted. It's just that they don't see it. It's far away. It's somebody who's starving in a faraway country. It's not like, and it's literally like 3 blocks from where a lot of us live.
Yeah.
In segregation, but you don't see it. It's over there. So then it's on to the farmers market or something. It's on to what we do in Madison that is so makes us the best place in America to do all these different things.
No, you're spelling it out really well, but I want to expand on that in just a minute. But one thing we should point out to folks who are watching us too is that we hope that this will be the first of many discussions. We hope to bring your partner Henry Sanders, a very accomplished African American leader, into this, and other folks among those contributors on your staff.
Yeah.
We do have the editor-in-chief white guy here today, but
Yep.
we can both joke about that because we're both people, I think, that that see that's important to hang out in South Madison or Selma or other places, and there's no diminishing the importance of that role. Part of the mission of a group like an organization like Madison 365 or the work that you did at the Madison Times is to provide images, be a catalyst for change by telling stories or enabling people to be able to tell theirs.
Right.
And so anyway, everything we're doing here, it'll take new dimensions, but on the other hand, it's great to have a full hour with you. Otherwise, we would very quickly feel frustrated, I think. So.
Well, I do want to mention really quick
Yeah.
that we not only want to tell the stories from a grassroots perspective, from a person of color perspective, but we want to show people how they can get involved.
Right.
How you can do different things as a community to make it a better community, and that's part of our goal. I mean, we will tell the happy. I mean, we have had a lot of controversy already in just 2 months. I mean, we've tackled a lot of things that people don't normally tackle, and that's what we want to do. But we also want to hey, this stuff's going on right 3 blocks from your house. You can get involved in it
Right.
in a second, and you can make this a less segregated city. So we want to do that too.
And yeah, part of the dilemma, we used to have race and media forums that were attached to the Equal Opportunities Commission. Part of it was the only news that generally was being covered in communities of color were about crimes, were about the negative side or
Right.
people in struggle. It's not that there aren't realities there, but first of all, those are struggles that are echoed in other communities as well. And
Yeah.
it was always a South Madison crime or murder or something.
Right.
Yeah. So I think we actually trained them finally into not calling it a South Madison, crime or whatever. Whether they backslid or not, I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it isn't so you want to push the envelope. You want to have an authentic discussion. That is part of the challenge of a Madison that often denies many of these realities or only carries on the conversation for a limited time, at which point people become impatient or uncomfortable.
Right.
And everybody who's been involved with civil rights movements or the LGBT movement or the disability rights movement, the feminist movement knows problems don't just go away in a couple of weeks. You got to stick with it. You can't be impatient.
Right.
And it may be inconvenient for you to realize, to think that something can't just be achieved closure and move on, but
Right.
you got to be with it over the longer term. So there's a bunch of different directions, but one thing I just want to know, I mean, you've been doing contemporary 24/7 stories for a long time, but where does history fit into this? And how important is it for you to teach the community at large and younger people in communities of color about the history that precedes all of this?
You talking about the Madison history or just civil rights
the Madison
in
history,
general?
the civil rights history, why seeing a movie like Selma opens eyes and makes people realize that something happened 50 years ago is still happening today.
We have to give millennials and younger credit. They do more.
Oh, they do.
Do
Yeah.
know more than we think.
Yeah, yeah.
And they're interested in it. And just because they weren't necessarily around, you can tell that they're interested in it, and they have a different perspective on it than we do, being a little bit older.
Well, they do, Dave, but I think the important thing is it's not that they don't have the interest or the initiative or the intelligence to grasp the history, but we don't give them a lot of opportunities. We don't teach a lot about the history of the civil rights movement in our schools.
Right.
We don't talk about it enough. I think the problem with majority culture is we're kind of very much in the moment. And we don't often, embrace the deeper legacy and the lessons that can be learned.
Yeah, no, and I'm a huge fan of history myself.
Yeah.
I mean, I get into everything, especially U.S. history. And so if anybody ever wants to listen to me talk about history,
Yep.
And sometimes it works your way into conversation because, we're covering things and we're like, do you know about the history of this? Do you know about the history of this in Madison? They're
Yeah.
covering something. Do you know what the Boys and Girls Club was before it was the Boys and Girls Club? Or, just talking to the writers. So we do delve into like the history and they know surprisingly a lot about civil rights history especially.
So this amplifies what you're saying. I think we sometimes older generations take for granted that young people first of all, that they don't get it the way that our generation does, or
they
we
always say
can be
that.
very discounting, especially folks who were part of the Vietnam War era, which is great. But no, you don't have a monopoly on being able to be righteous about different causes, and stop
Right.
being cynical about younger people, because often, whether it's the millennials or current young people or whatever, we toss out these. Oh well, either the truism that somehow young people are going to solve all our problems when they grow up, which discounts our obligation to work with them about this stuff, or again, there's that cynicism. Well, young people just aren't like it was when we grew up in the '60s. They just don't really think about these things or get these things, and how do we overcome that? How do we have faith in that audience that you're trying to reach
Right.
through mobile applications, through what you're doing?
Well, I think that we live in different times, and millennials. If you just look at college debt alone,
Right.
I mean, older people are just like, well, I paid for my college and working. It was $400, or whatever it was.
Right,
You could
right.
have a factory job in the summer and pay for it. And you can't do that anymore. They're facing, different crises, and so you can't really. There's a lot of things you can't compare them with, and I think millennials they get shortchanged all the time in the media. What's wrong with millennials? But I think that they're just fine. The ones that I see are just fine.
Yeah.
They're going through a different way, and they're creating things. They're creating different apps and different technology, and they're being very creative. You have to be very
Absolutely.
creative because not to get too deep, but the manufacturing jobs and everything that we used to have that you could have a steady life are not there. So they have to be creative in some ways.
Right.
So I have a different view of I'm a Generation X, and I feel some of the Generation X are starting to become like the boomers.
What
in,
year were you born? Yes.
October '72.
Okay.
So they're starting to be act like the boomers now. Like, whoa, when I was a kid, we had to,
Right.
and it's just like stop it. It's just so I deal with a lot of millennials, and maybe it's just the group that I'm dealing with, but they're a great, bright,
Yeah.
ambitious group. They're not lazy. They're not this or that, whatever we want to label them, and they're our future. So we have to really rely on them and guide them until they're ready to go at it themselves.
If I could prescribe a remedy for that, I think we all need sometime in the middle of our lives to go back to school and to relate to people who are high school, college, age again. And for me, from 2006 to 2010, it was such a blessing. Because whatever sense I had of cynicism, I was just so energized and so inspired by the young people I met. There's a few absurdities, like a boyfriend sitting on one side of me in a lecture hall and a girlfriend on the other, and they're texting to each other. I finally just got up and said, "Why don't you talk?" and there's this thing that I don't think this is apocryphal. I've said the story so many times I probably made it up. But there's actually this gathering at Thursday nights at the Memorial Union where people had to check their cell phones at the door and have conversation for 2 hours. And so having said that, I mean, this isn't so much, I'm just proving my point and being cynical about young people, but I think actually it all connects. And so there's things that our generation can learn from a younger generation and vice versa. Social media are just generally tools that can be used really well, but we also have to have personal interaction.
Oh,
and
yeah.
that's something that we can both learn from.
Right. No. And I want to point out that Madison 365. I mean, it's just it's energizing
Yeah.
for me to be around youth, just their ideas and things like that. And even our board is pretty 30s and 40s, is pretty youthful. And to me, that's exciting because they have different ideas and they have a view of the world that's different than ours.
Yeah.
I don't want to say more optimistic, but that we can do this. And when you talk about race relations, I mean, they have different views than Generation X's do and older people do. And I want to hear those views. I don't want to hear the same old views. I want to, okay, what do you think about this? Because maybe you're a little bit different than me. So that's where the age thing comes in with Madison 365. Just incredible points of view, and they're not always right, but they're different, and I want to hear them.
So as we have you back on future shows and have a chance to hear directly from some of those contributors, I'm sure this will flesh out more, but can you give us a couple of examples both of those controversial subjects that you guys have been able to tackle already in these first couple of months, but also, again, some of the, what Lele calls, the good news of the community that often is in the shadows because unfortunately, she talks about the second floor display at the municipal building. It's talking about the era of slavery. It's talking about all of the the challenges and horrible things that have happened. And it's not that, Malali's the last person to say we should ignore that stuff, but she's saying, but sometimes white culture just focuses in on it. I think that's the goal somehow, is to illuminate how horrible it's been and not seeing the other side, the strength and the resilience and the cultural richness that's also part of African American, Latino, Asian American, Native American, other experiences.
Yeah, and I think that one is depending on who you talk to too, because
Right.
I do run people who talk about all of the positive things too.
Yeah.
But we can't forget about the negatives. So I mean,
Well, it's great that you're doing a hybrid. You're doing both, because that's the way we need to view the world.
but I mean, as far as the topics that we cover, I mean, we the article that you mentioned before was, it had 82,000 reads.
Wow.
So it was because it was a national thing. People in New York and Austin and San Francisco about liberal cities and their struggle with racial. And I interviewed Tim Wise, who knows a lot of people too.
Yeah, he's
apparently.
a great person to talk to.
So he's like a national type of guy. But
Yeah, he's a white guy that is. He wrote a book like White Like Me, just to
Right.
sort of say that white people have a stake in all of this too.
But it's a topic that nobody really wanted to talk about,
Yeah.
but it was there. So when we let it out, it's just like, okay, oh yeah, this doesn't really want to talk about this very much. Let's discuss this. And so that was controversial. I recently did a story on African American policemen and the Black Lives Matter movement,
Right.
and how they're dealing with community policing and how they're dealing with relationships, and what do they feel about these things. And it was kind of an interesting long story to the dichotomy of being black and being a police officer in Madison, in this troublesome spot. So I mean, I don't remember ever seeing that or too much of that before. So we're trying to get to those questions. I don't say controversy, but questions that aren't asked very often that need to be asked.
You might have this on your radar, but at the Equal Opportunities Commission, where I'm a member, we heard a presentation about a recent focus group that was ostensibly about body cams, but it turned into a wider discussion about issues of trust with the police. I want to come back to that in a minute, but I don't want us to immediately go into the problematic deficit side, the challenges side, which is important. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about some of the stories that have illuminated, again, the positives, the resilience, the cultural richness of the communities you cover.
Yeah, I mean, they're numerous. I mean, they're just, we just did a story on La Movida, the Spanish language radio station. They came from nothing, and they built this radio empire that keeps everybody informed in the Latino community who would not normally have access to resources in health and in housing and employment. And it keeps them entertained, and they become much more than that, hosting events, and they become, that's an uplifting story. And we just a lot of artists, entertainers, things like that. We did a story on Oscar Morales and what he's doing at Omega. And
This is a school for helping people get their GEDs.
yeah, Omega School, and we'll did a story on NAACP and their Freedom Fund banquet and all the work that they've been doing, Dane County NAACP since they incorporated. So I mean, we try to tackle all of the good stuff too, because there's so many good stories out there, but we also want to get at the questions that haven't been asked, and I think that's just as important. We do that through a lot through our editorials. We have some really good editorial writers who are not afraid to ruffle some feathers,
Right.
And ask some questions, and those are the ones that people come to the most are the editorials. They like that.
We'll come back to the feather ruffling in a minute, but just to pick up on a couple of things. I think obviously part of the difficulty that is behind the attitudes that manifest toward young African American men, is, again, we only hear negative images. We have all kinds of stereotypes and assumptions we make. I think no matter how enlightened someone is, because of the movies and the TV and the news and everything else, that's in the back of your mind. You almost have to counter it every encounter that you have. And that's so unfair to these African American young men who, by and large, are just trying to make their way in the world despite all the challenges, really have a lot to offer, are not fitting with the stereotypes of a thug or some of the other negative things that we too often hear. So what have you done in terms of trying, since this is so central to the debate, to lift up young African American men? Or what do you hope to do?
What do we hope to? Well, we just keep telling those stories.
And it's individual stories too.
Individual
it's not just
stories. Like one of the YGB leaders, Eric Upchurch, I did a story on him,
he's
and I
an amazing
really
guy.
delved into some of his worst times, his worst times, and how he overcame those, and he's become this great leader in our community. But it wasn't just a quick interview. It was like we talked for hours and hours, and we really got into what he was going through at the time that made him behave like he did, and then how he overcame that to become one of the great leaders in our community. So, I mean, we'll do stories like that all the time. And that's what we plan on doing, those stories. And, you know, people in the greater community don't know him at all. They see him with YGB and they think this about him. They don't know what he's been through to make it to this point in his life, and they don't know all these little things about him. And those are the stories that we tell. I'm just using him because he's a guy that
but I think you're making a great point. I mean, so you know, but Eric is part of something bigger. But he's also not the same as M and Brandy and Andrew and some of the other people who are involved. Right. So you have to parse out of that the individual journey and the individual struggle.
Right, they're not all, you know, everybody's not all the same because they're in a group. They're all these individual personalities, and we want to really get at that. We want to highlight that. We want to, in doing that, we'll hopefully break down some walls that people are just like, when they see something, even liberal people, you know, they see something, oh, they're that. You know, liberal people are just smart enough to not say anything about it, but they think that because they've never had experiences. They'll be like, in my mind, they're that.
Right.
And then you give them a story like, oh, wait a second, they're this.
I think this is rooted in you guys, but I mean, there was a leadership series essentially to identify people, wasn't it? Or at least you reflected back on that?
I think we reflected, yeah.
Okay. Did it come from another place? Or?
Oh, you're talking about the...
we were just, you were, there was a process that reflected out on Facebook that was coming from you guys, I think, that talked about
African-American leaders?
Yeah, different leaders.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure, that was a Henry Sanders joint.
Okay, all right.
I mean, I was in an advisory role, but that was him.
So tell us a little bit about him. Yeah, tell us, if you could, I'm sorry to interrupt, but tell us a little bit about Henry, how the two of you came to know each other, and what his vision is. We'll have him back to tell, you know, his own side.
Yeah, he'd probably be the best person to talk about. Well,
there's no question about it. I guess what I would try to, since we have Dave here today, tell us what excited you about the things that Henry has brought forth to this project.
Oh, he's just, he's an entrepreneur. You know, he's just always thinking about of different angles. And he knows a lot of the same community people I do, but he also knows a different sector of people. So, you know, if we had a Venn diagram, you know, it crosses, but then he's got this whole sector of people, and I have my own sector of people, and so he's just all about ideas. You know, he has these great ideas, you know, and some, you know, we want to do, you know, and I think he's kind of, as far as the, you know, the journalism side is what I got most of the handle on here. You know, I'm keeping a handle on it, and he's got like a more of the vision side, the partnership side. You know, and I think that we all work together. And then we can't forget about Rob, because Rob,
please.
He's an amazing journalist.
Rob's last
too.
name again?
Rob Chappell.
Okay.
So, you know, by day he is the communications director at the Overture, and so he has a lot of ties to the communities too, and he's a great journalist, and you know, all three of us together, we're just constantly brainstorming, constantly texting each other like, we should do this, we should do this, we should do this, we should do this, and it's exciting, but it's also, you know, it's a lot of long hours. It doesn't end. It ends, you know, at 11 o'clock.
It's 24/7, 365.
Starts over at 6 in the morning. You know, like, oh, we got to do this, we got to do this, and so it's the point whenever you have a startup that, you know, you have all these ideas in here. Okay, we just have to figure out how to do things, you know, to build at a reasonable rate, and we have been doing. We're building faster than we thought we would.
Well,
and I thought we would, because we had to, you know, increase our bandwidth twice right out of the gate, and you know, people were coming to it. So, you know, we're a lot farther along than I thought we would be, which is good, but it brings on a whole new set of challenges.
I think you're embracing something called social entrepreneurship. You know, that is a different model. You know, it's not grounded necessarily in the for-profit corporate next quarterly statement type short-sightedness that capitalizes. You know, capitalism is not a bad thing, but when it's misused, or when it's used for purposes of greed and not the common good, it's always had to be in partnership with all of those community values. And I think you're hitting on something there.
Yeah, I know. I agree with that. I agree with your assessment there.
Yeah,
that's
right. I think you probably would. Yeah. So, but just to come back to Henry and I'm sorry, Charles.
Rob.
Excuse me.
Chappell.
I apologize. I don't think Rob and I have had a chance to meet yet, so that's why his name.
You should have him on the show.
We will do that. We will do that. Yeah, I guess since for folks who don't know Henry, I mean, so his background. I mean, I think this would be true of both Henry and Rob. You're not to diminish you, but I mean, a lot of your background is in the grassroots. You know, going to the festivals, being in the communities, being on the boards and things like that. But it sounds like
true.
No, but it sounds
I know
like
some bigwigs though.
Oh, you do.
I know you.
Present company is yeah, whatever. But
no, that's true. That's a fair assessment.
No, I think so too. I was just
very grassroots.
But I mean, that is part of this venture is to have your feet in more than one world.
Yeah.
And so Henry, just if you could flesh out a little bit more his background, I think he's run for office.
Oh,
he's been involved with state government and other things where, he said, part of the challenge of civil rights is trying to bring change into existing institutions and seats of power, and to include communities of color and all of that. So he and Rob, it sounds like, are maybe good bridge builders to help achieve some of that.
Oh, they definitely are. They both are. And Henry ran for lieutenant governor a few years ago, statewide.
Yeah.
So he probably traveled to all 72 counties at some point, to do that. And so when we came up with our list, he was able to name all of these people from outside of Madison, and even outside of Milwaukee. You think of people of color,
So it's called Madison365.com, but it's not necessarily just Madison.
Well, for this feature, it wasn't. It was a state. It was the whole
Right.
state. And so we brought in the people from Appleton and from all over the state, and people were asking, what's this? And so that's how we kind of like, especially Milwaukee people are like, oh, wow, we got to start, and then the State Journal picked it up on it in their Sunday paper and had a whole, their section for that, and Channel 3000, picked up on it too. So that brought a lot of attention to us too. And we're going to do it for Latinos coming up too.
Excellent. And Madison, and you mentioned Channel 3000 now, a lot of the stuff that you're producing is going to reflect out on their site.
Yeah, we have a partnership with them, so you'll be able to see a lot of our articles at their site, and you probably have been for the last few weeks.
So a lot of what we're, I think, entering into is to talk about, again, in the new media realities and how social media has an impact on the world, how things essentially go viral, like that article on all of those different cities that it had a national impact. So it was a national interest. It gave you those 85,000 hits. But anyway, can you just expand a little? This is, how are you thinking strategically about the fact that people aren't just going to the Madison365.com site, but maybe stuff that you write eventually we picked up on HuffPost or blogs that address different communities of color, or both locally, nationally, globally? Is there a potential that what you do here could have that wider effect?
Oh yeah, definitely. Especially things that we cover that are national, and Madison is kind of under the microscope of what is going on. It's a mid-sized city that's going through demographic changes, and how they react to these changes can be a model for other cities. So in ways people are looking at, people look at to us anyway, with Tony Robinson, with the race equity report, people look to Madison for certain things. So the things that we comment on, the stories that we write, are national stories in a lot of ways. And when we hit one like that one that we talked about that got picked up by everybody, that's a national story. Racial disparities in liberal cities, that's huge. And I expect that we'll have a lot more like that are Madison 365 topics, but they're also national topics, and other people are interested in it.
So when I was in Selma in early March, I found about Tony Robinson, on a Saturday morning after the Friday night of the shooting, from the stage, an African-American leader. We were in a panel in which we were comparing the experiences of people who were teenagers in 1965 with teenagers today, and trying to say, hey, you can do it too. Young people have always been a part of this, but there was an extra aspect. First of all, getting that announcement, being down in Selma when that happened, and thinking, I'm from Madison, Wisconsin, wearing my Wisconsin hat and having people know I was from there. At first, I was kind of trepidatious because, what an embarrassment, what a horrible thing. I mean, not so much an embarrassment, what a tragedy. And it's associated with the place I've lived for years and I care about. But what was interesting, this national resonance you're talking about, people throughout that weekend came up to me, and there was a parallel situation with another young black person who had died, and of course in places like Baltimore or in South Carolina, all over the country, probably 24 examples where this tragedy has repeated for very similar dynamics. There's a mental health disparate ability to provide care that was a thread that people brought up in communities of color, all these other themes. But to come back to your point, what happens here does have a broader impact. I was discouraged on a day like that. I did not want to leave Selma and Montgomery, as I saw on Facebook, all of the denial and let's wait 6 months to discuss this until the proper process works its way through, not understanding the anger and the fear that young people of color, especially, and other young people were feeling after Tony Robinson. But what it comes down to is this community. We both feel this. Some days it really discourages us. It really, I think, messes us up how much we aren't getting things. But on the other side of the coin, there's opportunities here. What happens here if we do it right could be something that's an example to the nation.
Right. I mean, we have a chance here to do things, and Tony's I was so sad about that. Just to to think about what his mom and his family and all his friends, the East Side community that he was part of, where he knew so many people, and it was just, that was really sad. But I'm just, I'm hoping that we can build something positive here in our community because of that. I'm hoping that that we can trigger people. We were talking before about how people get excited about something and then they kind of dip, like the 2008 State of Black Madison report. I'm sure you remember that. People got excited about it because it was an early
Well, there was equity stuff from '97 where we had all these great projects that all faded away.
And people get all excited, like, oh, I can't believe it's going on, and then 2 weeks later they forgot about it. But I don't think people have quite forgot about the Race to Equity report yet.
Okay.
I think there's a positive thing going on, and we have to keep the positivity going.
Yeah.
But it takes work. It takes a lot of elbow grease, and it's a lot of work that doesn't get a lot of acclaim. And sometimes people in Madison shy away from that kind of work. Sometimes they don't. So we kind of need that right now. And Madison is that unique city right now that can do amazing things because we have so much talent here. We have so much resources. We have so much wealth. We have so much activism. We have crazy activism here. I mean, the amount
more
of people
nonprofits per capita than any other place in the
know,
country.
But just the activists we have here, are just, it's insane how much we have to work with here. So if we can't do it in Madison, where can we do it?
I think we're just prone to distractions sometimes. We're also, you were mentioning earlier the phenomenon of Walker, all the people that showed up at the Capitol. I think there's a bunch of dimensions to that. Some positive, but also, you and I are both hanging out on Facebook. Of course, you're dealing with the social media now. Sometimes I feel like folks are so short-sighted, they're drawing the wrong lessons. I do not need to hear another person who's talking about, I'm going to move from Wisconsin tomorrow because of that Walker. Walker is responsible is the root of all evil. Every problem that we have is all about Walker. And it's just, it means that we don't take responsibility for our own actions, our own need to get out into diverse communities, to learn, to embrace. We all, it also means we're ahistorical. Again, if a white person thinks that somehow you identify a problem and you can wrap it up neatly in 2 weeks, and doesn't understand the decades and the perseverance to go into everything that's important in this world, then they're just going to, they are going to up and leave us. Anyway, there was somebody 2 days ago. It was a firestorm. It was a guy who was an aide at the Capitol who'd been involved in the Capitol uprising, but he just put the simple, innocent question out there. So there are days when I think about leaving Wisconsin. Do you feel that way too? And all but 3 of the 300 some responses were saying, yeah, I'm going to leave too. And it was mostly folks of privilege who have the ability to leave this place.
Right.
So anyway.
What Walker has done, without getting too political,
he's hurt.
It's
okay to get political, Dave. But yeah.
His maneuvers have hurt the poor and the people of color the most. It's an inconvenience for people. And Madison is well off. So, I'm not saying people haven't been hurt by him, but they don't get, when you get lopped up your badge of care when you lose your ability to get food, or you only got to get certain kind of food, you can't get shellfish and all these different things. I mean, that's affecting your bottom line survival, and that doesn't affect a lot of the white people in Madison. I'm not saying that some of the things he doesn't do is bad, but they live in Madison. They live in a little green zone, and they're going to leave the state. Madison is,
where do they plan to go? Are they not aware that the rest of the world is going through many of the same struggles? I mean, until recently, Canada had a very conservative government was doing things. I mean, maybe there's potential help now, but.
Walker, he gets blamed for racial disparities in Madison. Like, oh, that's Walker's Wisconsin. Like, no, that's
it's
liberal
not.
Madison. So I understand what you're saying, because he's the boogie monster and Obama's the boogie monster for other people who are more conservative, and he gets blamed for everything. But it keeps us from taking our own personal responsibility on things that are going on in our own liberal city.
Well, and the irony that, there's a $300 million cut to the UW system, all the other things. I mean, that disproportionately affects on communities of color. That means that we're going to develop institutions that are only available to the elite who can afford them.
Right.
And so there's very real costs, not just for the white liberal community in Madison for Walker, but for other communities. So that's a reality. But again, it's that we somehow focus so singularly on that and feel like, oh, well, we lost that battle 3 years ago. Again, I don't think we did. I think over the longer term, I think the unions may come back. I think workers' rights may go to the fore. He has gotten so bad. His approval rating is dipping down. The guy was a flash in the pan as a presidential candidate. We also had to flash back to 1957 when Joe McCarthy and supermajorities of very conservative reactionary Republicans were in control. 6 years later, we had Gaylord Nelson and Bill Proxmire and Pat Lucey and things had changed. Things were going in a positive direction. That could happen again.
Things like that ebb and flow. But if you're like on the bottom rung, you get hit the worst.
Right.
And that's those are the people that I worry about the most. No matter who is the governor, my life is going to be mostly the same.
Right.
Whether it's and talking about president also. I mean, there's a couple things, obviously, but the people that are the poorest always get hit the hardest by this.
So just to reflect back on that Facebook cynicism, I mean, there's great things that happen. It's just like Madison in general. There are great ideas that are floated. I'm not about to pull away from Facebook. Some people say they're overwhelmed by it.
Yeah, it's hard for me to do that too.
Occasionally I have to block somebody who's just getting too obnoxious and too personal about this, or whatever. But so it is the new public square, I think, in some ways. Although, like that those pages you were talking about in the Cap Times or in other publications, where unfortunately bigots are empowered by their anonymity, and they put the most obnoxious stuff out there, which I hope is not typical of general public opinion.
We're starting to get them at our site.
Yeah, so I do think moderation is important, because you don't want to give those people, they have enough of a view in the world, and again, I think, I'm sorry, somebody is a coward if they espouse those things anonymously.
Yeah, no, I agree.
We have to counter that. But the other recent thing that happened on Facebook to me. Again, it was someone that had expressed this. What they said was, I will not name her, but she's somebody who's on the county board and somebody I have a lot of respect for, but somebody who has a very powerful voice and really does a lot of great things. But she just kind of made the casual observation, gosh, I had lots of black friends in college, but I really don't get out into places where I have black friends anymore. Anybody else feel the same way? And again, 300 people chimed in. Yes, they felt the same way. And you spend all your time with your kids and and your neighbors and going to cookouts and stuff like that. And Madison is really not all that diverse a place, or a place where there really are opportunities to get to know people of color. And golly gee whiz, I just have such a busy life. I just don't have time for that. I'm sorry, but you have a responsibility, especially if you're raising kids, to get yourself out beyond your own damn neighborhood and into other places. And there are so many opportunities here. The University of Wisconsin is the most diverse campus other than Harvard in terms of the numbers of international students, in terms of one types of diversity. But also we still have this prevailing myth that Madison is a homogeneous community. You go to a first grade class and it's minority. Not to mention the overall demographics. When I moved here in 1978, I don't know, it was 7 or 8% people of color. Now it's well over, approaching 25%. So we really are not getting connected in the ways that we need to be.
Yeah, and the weird part is it's really not that hard.
Right.
And it's not like you're getting a root canal or something. It's
as you had 2 days
as
ago.
I did, and I had
not to laugh,
but a lot of these events that you can go to in different communities are fun. They got dancing, they got great food, they have entertainment, it's social. I mean, it's fun stuff. I could see if it was like, oh, we got to go do this, but just go do something you wouldn't normally do. Intermingle, make a friend.
Our friend Hetty Rudd, is such a brilliant photographer. I mean, as are you, but she captures, the spirit of a place like Celebrate South Madison. I encourage people to Google John Quinlan's Vimeo account. There's a great video I made, a montage of her photos from a celebration I helped organize a couple of years ago. But so you talked about this in a number of times at the Madison Times. That you and John Gramling are often the only white guys or virtually, not completely, but yeah, it's not that you're spending your time sitting around being self-righteous and pointing at other people. It's such a tragedy. It's such a loss for people that can't find it in themselves to venture a couple of miles out of their way to experience some of this great stuff. And again, I think this is something that Madison365.com could be a catalyst for, is getting people excited. These are people, think twice about traveling down to Chicago to see the museums or going to Europe or all over the world. There's a world that they need to discover right here in Greater Madison.
Well, and if you have more friends that are different than you and are going through different experiences with you, you're more likely to have empathy for that, and you're more likely to work towards changing that. So I always go back to, it's not that people are bad, it's just that it's just that it would help to have more experiences to really, if they want to become soldiers, or I don't want to say soldiers, but they want to become activists.
Foot soldiers is a common term. Yeah. We can use a little bit of a military analogy.
Right. It's just it doesn't really take much just to get started. And once you start, you might actually like it. And then last thing we want is Madison to become Milwaukee. And that's what we're fighting against, and that's what all of Madison should be fighting against, the most segregated city in the nation.
Well, so you're right to point out that statistically speaking, Milwaukee is the most segregated city, but you also pointed out this dynamic that you go 3 blocks in any direction in Madison, you go from a predominantly low-income neighborhood, like on the southwest side, to a place with $1.5 million mansions, and yet those become gated communities. Those become communities that don't interact or see common cause. So Lisa Subeck and Barbara McKinney and other people who represented districts like that, part of their goal is how do we bring people together?
Yeah, no, and we do have that. We do have segregation here.
Yeah,
it's not nearly as bad as Milwaukee, but I mean that's what we could become.
No,
I live by Darbo. I mean, if you just
let me just put a caveat on that. But in Milwaukee, they actually they identify the need to, I think, achieve at least even if the housing situation, the fair housing is more daunting. At least there are efforts to recognize the problem. Here, we're still at a basic level of not understanding the dilemma sometimes.
No, I agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're down to about our last 3 minutes. It's one metaphor or I think common experience to you're right. It's about people getting to know other people, to hear their stories, to develop relationships of trust. So many nonprofit boards, they say, well, we want people of color, but we sent them an email and left a phone call and they never return our calls, so I guess they're really not interested. It's like, why would anybody do that? Why would anybody respond to somebody who doesn't even have the courtesy to take somebody to lunch or get to know them or go to their table and do things? So that's part of the dilemma. But with the LGBT struggle here, we've had more openly lesbian and gay elected officials and bi and trans folks involved in the life and the fabric of the community. And it was the same kind of thing. I really think we could do the same with communities of color, the same kinds of initiatives, the efforts to understand the extra obstacles that folks have in running for office. Case in point, Everett Mitchell has just announced he's going to run for circuit court judge. We have to get behind him with every ways that we can. I don't even know who his opponent is or whatever, but we need to understand that a promising young leader like that, who's been so courageous and has brought so many people and communities and causes together, he faces extra obstacles. We got to get behind the Everett Mitchells of the world.
Yeah, no, he's a good guy. I like him a lot, and I kind of knew he was going to do it, but I
wasn't surprised either. But
I was excited to hear about that, and we need more leaders like that.
And to touch briefly on that, the diversity that exists within the LGBT community in terms of racial and cultural diversity, the same diversity exists within Black communities too. What he has done so courageously is to recognize there have always been parishioners and church leaders and others in their midst. And the condemnation of any aspect of the community is wrong, and so we have to embrace.
And people have they've said negative things about him because he's taken those stances. But he just keeps soldiering on.
Or I think what they've said is that why would you do that? That is so politically foolish to take a risk like you're taking. You got to take risks. You got to be out there. You got to be.
And I think that goes to tie everything. It goes for everything. It goes for Madison 365. We've taken some risks, and we got to take some risks, and we got to get out of our comfort zones. And that goes for all of Madison. Has to get out of their comfort zones and try a few things. You might like it.
I think the lesson is so people are saying Russ Feingold or Tammy Baldwin will never get elected, or a Shirley Chisholm's candidacy is invaluable, or Barack Obama. The cynics who just said, "Oh, that will never work." People like to be challenged. They like to see diverse images in the movies and media and everything else. But we just got to stop being invested in the status quo and realize the promise that comes with pushing the envelope, having an authentic picture, and that's what you're doing at Madison365.com.
Yeah. Well, and the world is changing.
Yeah.
And Madison should reflect that.
Absolutely. Hey, Dave Dahmer, it's been a great pleasure.
Thank you for having me. I had a good time.
It was a great conversation, and one of many, I hope, this has been Forward Forum. My guest has been Dave Dahmer, the editor-in-chief and publisher of Madison365.com. Check it out online. You can find out more about our show, provide your ideas and feedback by writing to us at forwardforumshow@gmail.com or contacting us via email or phone here at the Sun Prairie Media Center. Thanks very much for joining us, and have a great week.